So he combines a long time window to get good
6
frequency
seconds.
resolution, and that's what all the jaggedness is. That's a good frequency resolution. It's telling you up and down at a very, fine frequency scale. And then the 0.1 second graph is much coarser, but it gives you the pattern that's more localized to the time scale of the event. And so he looks where they intersect, basically. And there's a long peak across all the low frequencies until it gets close to, I don't know, 50 or 60, and then it starts to drop. But it overlaps best in this little bump, that corresponds with one of the peaks below, a range of peaks. And so this is how he chose this frequency. And I don't know, if it were me, I probably would have, he may have found this after trial and error of trying a little on the other side of it. It's certainly possible. I'm just thinking of the analogy of twisting a radio dial until you find the signal and the noise. And so when he filtered at this frequency and did something called a Hilbert transform, the 20 to 25 hertz band shows this null spike very clearly. And so here we have on the y-axis in the top left, we have on the y-axis what's called analytic power, which is a Hilbert amplitude, which is times its complex conjugate, or we can call it amplitude squared roughly, but it's the idea. And then time on the y-axis. So this is how the amplitude modulation is occurring, and these are many repetitions. All the lines and the different colors are many trials, all aligned,
So we might understand properly that between the spikes you have meaningful signals, and at the spikes you have receptivity to the
at the spike,
chaotic receptivity.
Well, the spike initiates the background state, the desynchronized state. And then between spikes, you have both states. The spike occurs at the beginning of the desynchronized state. So there's an entire cycle from desynchronized.
In each of these trials, in each of these lines through there, you have this.
Yes, you're not going to see it on this graph. But yes, he's looking for the spike that he predict had to be there.
Is the spike I see on the graph, is that the spike?
Yes. This is one spike, and you see it's about 350 milliseconds between the spikes. So in this 350 milliseconds, the bulb will go into an AM pattern somewhere up at the peak, and then it will go back to desynchronize at the end of
it's
that.
essentially our cognitive cycle.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, and look at the when he filters the signal. This is the calculation from the power. This graph in the top right is actually taken by analyzing this bottom right. But when he aligns all of them, you get a theta gamma pattern. I mean, this is so yes, this is one of our cognitive cycles, and this is the wave packet.
I don't know what wave packet means.
Wave packet means a clump of activity relative to a clump of lesser activity. I mean, it's a very intuitive.
Where can you see the wave packet on that graph?
Yeah, it's like right here. It's the big part. It's the fat part.
The fat part, not one of the individual spike-like things.
No. The little. See.
The wave packet is one of the clumps.
Yes.
So we've got one wave packet there and maybe the beginning of another one on the right.
Yeah, see, this is the signal at one particular point, and this is an amplitude modulation pattern. Okay?
So,
But there's a
so
pattern
that
over.
also in our terminology gives us a cycle.
Yes,
That's one cognitive cycle.
I think so. Yes.
And is the time correct on there?
What do you mean, is it correct?
Or is it the right length of time
Yeah,
over that packet?
350 milliseconds from the beginning of the packet to the end.
From where to where? Show
Okay,
me.
here's 21.1,
Yeah,
and here's 21 point, I'm calling that 4.5, and that's roughly, you know,
uh-huh,
so that's roughly 350.
300 milliseconds,
Yeah.
so, yeah,
Pretty good agreement.
yes.
And then this last one is just the frequency here, which is showing that in between the spikes, you know, there's this little bit where it's desynchronized, and then it gets into a synchronized state and stays there very well until the next spike. So this is what he called a limit cycle, and later he characterized it as near limit cycle. So the bulb is going from a chaotic attractor, which is the background state, to a near limit cycle attractor, which is representing,
Something.
not represent, it's responding to the stimulus. Okay? So that was all in.
And I still don't understand why you can't say it represents.
Oh, no, you can, we can, we can, but
Okay.
I'm just.
But Walter never liked that at all.
Well, he had to argue with the philosophers, I guess,
I
and,
guess,
and,
maybe
and,
that's what was doing.
yeah, so,
Okay.
we don't have to do that unless we want to. Okay, so, he did this in other primary sensory areas and kind of summing up, and so we can get, over to some little cognitive interpretation. The neural activity, is not solely determined by the stimulus properties, and it's related to the meaning of the stimulus for the organism and its behavior. The neurodynamics is bistable, is the term, or metastable, and the desynchronized state corresponds to a receiving phase, a coherent state to a transmitting phase. And this is the source of his cinematic hypothesis, and these frames are occurring at theta frequency, sometimes delta frequency. They seem to be linked to sensory, the way our sensors work. You know, there's some suggestions, not well developed, that saccades happen at a theta frequency. That could be why theta shows up in some cases. And Detlef Heck and Robert Kozman, Walter Freeman, and half a dozen other people published an article this year showing that respiration and olfaction are linked, and that if you cut the respiratory receptors, the delta rhythms in the brain are linked to olfaction, and that if you disable the olfactory cortex, the delta rhythms in the whole brain drop out. And he's also done some things to show that it's not artifactual, and namely, the delta rhythm is correlated with what's happening in the brain. It's not just some kind of, background wave that the brain has to bob up and down on. It's actually relevant to the way the brain is working, and it is set up through
Now,
olfaction.
Steve, I understood that the mucus that runs over the cribriform plate carries the odor.
Yeah, that's where the receptors are.
Yes, and then there's a certain flow rate, I've forgotten. It's a continual flow system, and I'm interested in your correlating this with respiration, because the flow over the plate is continuous.
Okay.
So I would think the bulb would be getting a continuous supply of chemical stimulus, but then respiration brings in a new bunch of stuff. I'm trying to correlate.
This question would need us to look in more detail at the paper that Detlef et al. wrote.
Okay, I dropped the
And
question.
let's maybe try, we could do an online meeting or something and look at that paper together. I would enjoy that if you want to do that. But yes, yeah, for now, I do want to.
No,
Yeah, no, I don't want, that's a good question, and I do want to look at that paper more closely. But for here, the point is that the frame rates may be related to me, this seems to be part of the gateway of external dynamics coupling with internal dynamics. And then there's something called a phase cone that came out of the Hilbert analysis. It's not on the previous slide, but it results from the same sort of analysis, and it is a sign of the emerging pattern. And he's seeing cases where this phase cone can spread out and cover an entire cortical hemisphere in a very rapid time scale. I think it's a picture of the global broadcast.
That's interesting.
And I believe,
Yeah,
I've got to look at it again, but I've got the 2016 book that Kozma and Freeman co-authored, one of his last publications, prehumously. January 2017 is posthumous. But in there, he begins to, he mentions the global workspace theory in an early chapter and the connection between them. And I think he was always cautious about making the leap that we've made, Bernie and you and I have made with the rhythms hypothesis, but he seems to have gotten real close to endorsement of that
so
hypothesis.
10 to 20 milliseconds is the length of time of the broadcast. That's what we think of as the ignition, how long the ignition takes to cover a cortex.
Yes.
It's pretty fast.
Yep.
Really?
It's the speed of sound. Okay, now that was the review, and I promised to say some things about K-sets, which I can do. This is really, Freeman called these the building blocks of neurodynamics and how brains make up their mind. He never used the term K-sets, and in fact, I had to figure out what he was talking about in that book referred to K-sets, and that actually, it was almost like a puzzle. But so there are 6 K-sets numbered 0 through 5. We'll talk about them each in a moment. And the goal is to explain how the population dynamics emerges from the neuronal dynamics in the brain. And these
Population of,
the population dynamics in neurodynamics, population of neurons. Neuronal refers to single neurons. Population refers to
Okay.
Yeah. So.
yeah,
And so they are, the K-sets are not equivalent to, but they are related to the hierarchy of electrical activity, microscopic, mesoscopic, and macroscopic, that refer to numbers of neurons.
yes.
So the micro is like, a few neurons to maybe at most a few hundred. Meso is in the 10,000 neuron range, and macroscopic is, a million up to the whole brain. In that kind of neck of the woods. Now, there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but there is a relationship between the hierarchy, the K-sets, which are hierarchical, and this hierarchy of organization in the neuronal substrate. So these K-sets are collections of excitatory and inhibitory neurons and their connections, and it's their connection patterns and their exact constitution that determine what kind of set they are. And each of these sets represents a system of nonlinear differential equations that can be approximated with a piecewise, what he calls a piecewise linearization. And all right, this is one of the kind of precursors to the whole K-set model, and it shows what's happening in a single neuron. What is being measured on the EEG is mostly the dendritic depolarization that happens when axon signals reach the terminus and release neurotransmitter that crosses the synapse. When it gets to the other side, it doesn't immediately cause action potentials. It causes depolarization of the membrane that gives a graded signal. And he calls this the W potential, or wave potential, the wave activation. And then the...
So, Steve, with that, okay, so you said that this pattern we're seeing is the dendritic pattern that we're seeing. So if you have, let's say, 10,000 dendrites that are going into a particular, or that are part of a particular neuron, are we saying that there's some kind of synchronization across all of those different?
No, there's an averaging.
Okay, so this is the...
We're talking about what makes up the EEG signal.
Okay.
And it's not going to be a single neuron in that case.
Okay.
But there is going to be a wave activation, or a mean value for the signal that manifests as a wave, and then there's a trigger zone on the body, on the axon soma, called the axon hillock, I believe.
What's the P in that?
It's the pulse.
The pulse that's coming through from...
No, that's the axon side.
From the presynaptic there.
See, the idea is that there's a wave signal that gets converted into a pulse signal.
Yes.
And this happens over and over. And then the pulse signal is coming in, and it gets converted into a wave signal.
Oh, okay. I think I understand. So, okay. So, I mean, the way that I understand the way that a neuron works is that when you get enough of that wave signal, then you're going to get some activation on the, you mentioned the hillock, so you're going to get some sort of that pulse that results at that point once the wave pattern reaches a certain threshold, right?
That's right. And so when he says zero here, that's what he's talking. That zero is going to be whatever the threshold is. Okay. But you see the wave. The pulse level is reflected by a firing rate, and the wave pattern is represented by a membrane
potential. Sure.
Yes.
Okay.
And when essentially the firing rate. The thing is, we're not looking at what you're talking about with the threshold is when a resting neuron gets triggered to fire. But we're talking about a neuron that has some sort of basal rate of activity. It's firing with an ongoing pattern.
Okay.
And so then how does that firing rate change as a function of the potential across its dendrites?
Right.
And if you look at it in detail, it's going to have some microscopic structure to what happens. But if you do an average, you can create a relation between a wave and a pulse form of the neuronal code or the neuronal signal. And so there's two conversions. One is at the synapse, where the pulse pattern gets converted into a wave, and it has a linear range, but it saturates. Okay, you can have this in the inhibitory. The inhibitory.
So the y-axis there is voltage.
Yeah. Yes. Think of it as the activity of the wave signal. as a result. Think of it as output. Think of this as input and output. That's sort of how Freeman kind of conceptualizes it. That the pulse here is input and the wave is output. And so this is an input-output relation, this graph. Now this is also an input-output relation, but it's,
Over the
yes. And so here's,
neuron and its axon to, that's where the next wave that goes, the next pulse that goes into the next. No, I'm going backwards.
this is an integration zone for all the signals coming in through the dendrite, which are represented by W as an average over all of them. But all these different depolarizations and perhaps hyperpolarizations conduct from the synapses down and get integrated at the trigger zone, and then based on the value at that point, it's going to have a firing rate that once above a threshold, it's going to be linear for a time. It's going to mostly be in a linear zone for the physiologic range. These dotted areas are for things that aren't in the range of a normal neuron's physiology. And so for the most part, it stays in this zone, and it's a linear relationship between how much excitation it's receiving and how much its firing rate is. Okay. Now, when you go to population dynamics, it works differently. And again, here for the W, you're looking at an EEG signal over a surface of cortex, and he discusses the difference between, this is a called LFP, but there's something called local mean fields, which, you know, the LFP may sum or average over whatever the actual field values are at different points. You know, it has a much coarser structure, and so it's much more of an approximate, but it gives you a good indication of the underlying activity on average. And so here you have first off, you have a baseline activity, a firing activity, and this is one of the key things that gets into K-sets in a moment. That a bunch of neurons that are in their resting state, they're going to have a baseline firing rate in an ensemble. They keep each other talking. And if you think about the baseline noise at a football game or a baseball game, the baseline noise of the crowd, it's never totally quiet in there. And not unless there's a great inhibition going on. So these input-output relations are the basis. This nonlinearity that occurs at the ensemble level is the basis, theoretical basis, and I don't fully understand this, but it's the basis for creating the K-sets from K0 on up. Now, what K0 is it's a single neuron or a set of neurons that are not interacting, that have globally common inputs and outputs. So for instance, a relay system in the thalamus that's just carrying activity from the retina to the primary visual cortex could be modeled as a K0 set, I believe. They're not interacting, meaning they're not stimulating each other. And so that's globally common inputs and outputs. They're all getting the same inputs and they're all sending their output to the same place. That can be modeled as a K0 set. Now a K1 is just built up out of pairs of pairs of interacting K0. And the K1 excitatory is the background noise. Freeman claims, and this is not something that the mainstream neuroscience community has gotten wise to, I believe, or maybe it's starting to happen. But if we go back here and we look at this saturation level that occurs, you don't need inhibition to keep the brain from going into a seizure state. The refractory periods of the individual neurons keep them from getting into runaway excitation. So you can have a group of neurons that are exciting themselves and they don't go crazy. Just like, you know, people at the football game don't go crazy unless you do something crazy. So in a normal state, excitatory neurons can generate this background noise that's observed in the brain. And then if you have a pair of inhibitory sets, each one is inhibiting the other, but if one of them gets excited, then it's going to inhibit the other one much more. And so if you got a bunch of them, you know, this is a winner-take-all type situation, and it can serve to sharpen the input, make it more focused. You know, and so there's a number of places where this kind of set occurs, but it's not as pertinent to what we're going to talk about next. The K2 set is when you have an inhibitory and an excitatory population that have a negative feedback loop, and this is what gets the oscillations going. And examples of a K2 set are the olfactory bulb or the prepiriform cortex. Now we get to see some graphs of these things. So K0, K1, and K2, the top is what happens if you send an impulse, a stimulus impulse, into a K0 set. It responds by getting more active. Its firing rate, and you know, or goes up, or the electrical, you know, the local field potential goes up, but then it returns to baseline very quickly.
All right, so the peak there, just to make sure I understand, that's saying that is the fastest possible firing rate? That's not a single...
No. This is its response to a stimulus, an impulse stimulus.
Okay, so it's either let's say, take the easy case, a single neuron is responding to an input stimulus.
Yeah.
Now that input stimulus is being responded to by a firing pattern.
Yeah.
When I see a single, you know, amplitude there...
Think of it as firing rate.
That's what I said, so that when we have the peak of that, then that is the fastest firing rate that neuron will produce in response to a stimulus.
No. You can't generalize from the fastest it could produce to any stimulus from its response to a single stimulus. This is just its response to a single stimulus, hypothetical trial stimulus.
Somehow I feel like we're talking about different things.
Okay.
Okay, so earlier we were talking about okay, so you had your W and you had your P. This is related to the W and the P?
This is related to the K0 set.
Okay.
Don't try to connect the slide before here. Don't try to connect this to this right now. I'm not sure how that's not what's happening here.
Okay, so explain one more time then. Amplitude means...
Okay.
Of what?
This is the response of the population.
The response of the population
It could be measured as an amplitude of voltage.
Okay.
Or it could be measured as an increase in firing rate.
Okay.
It's simply the response of the neuron to an electrical input.
Okay.
Okay, and so
the response of the K0 set, which may be a neuron or more than one,
thank you.
but not
Yes,
interactive.
correct. You are correct. So it doesn't have to be a neuron. But the point here is that you have different dynamics across these different sets. Freeman is looking at the dynamics of a single neuron and trying to understand how you get to the dynamics of the bulb and beyond. And this is his mathematical theory, which agrees nicely with his experiment, it turns out. At the first level, the ground level of complexity, you get a pretty simple response. You get a impulse response. It very cause and effect like. When you have the K1 set, you can have a prolongation of the response, which, you know, by now the impulse has gone away. Think of the impulse as being something that's maybe about as wide as this. And here you have a response that lingers, so it has a little bit of a memory, relative to the K0 set, but not that much more complex. Now, the inhibitory, the excitatory and inhibitory K2 set, which is constructed out of K1 sets. Here, the diagram doesn't mean that all of these E circles sets are equivalent. I don't believe. But so you have, so these must be K1 sets in order to have a K2 set. But the response can produce oscillations. And it's similar to a damped harmonic oscillator in kind of a rough way. So this is really adequate to explain what the bulb does.
Uh-huh.
But when he wants to look at how the pre-piriform and the whole olfactory system works, he has to go to the K3 level. And so this part is the olfactory bulb, and it can be modeled as a K2. Actually, each of these, the anterior olfactory nucleus, I believe, yeah, it looks like a K2 also, because of the inhibitory and excitatory. And so this K3 set of the olfactory system is a collection of K2 sets. And so K3 is multiple interacting K2 sets. Examples are the olfactory and hippocampal systems. And the claim is that at this level, you can have learning and pattern classification. And in theory, the K sets could be used computationally to carry out these functions. In practice, they rapidly become computationally intractable to solve the differential equations. Okay, but now the multiple interacting K3 sets, he's got a model for the entire limbic system, which is the hippocampus and a number of other areas, and claims that cognitively this will accomplish navigation. And the K4 sets interacting can give you the whole cortex, and it is believed by Freeman and colleagues that cognition, the brain's ability to cognize, can be explained by this level of analysis.
At one point, I remember the diagram of that Freeman made that I liked so well, of the nervous system of a salamander.
Yes,
So that diagram,
that's the K4 level.
that's the K4 level,
Yes,
yes.
that's the most primitive mammal that has the whole paleocortex and everything.